welcome to this episode of the Smart Leaders Sell podcast. I'm Jessica Lorimer, sales coach and leadership expert, and I am so excited to talk to you guys about podcasting today and the power of podcasting and what it can really do for your business. I've had a few questions about whether or not people should create podcasts over the last couple of weeks. And given that I am in 3 weeks' time on the countdown speaking at Upreneur, which I'm super excited about, and that Upreneur is where I decided to keep my podcast going. So at that point, I'd only had my podcast for 2 months. I am really excited to be talking to you guys about whether or not you should create a podcast. And if so, what kind of work are you going to be required to actually do? But first, dates to go into the diary. We are launching in November a brand new series on the podcast for 1 week only called 6 Figures and Beyond, the real sales strategies behind the success. And I'm really excited because I have managed to get some of my favorite internet marketers, favorite business people, and just generally amazing entrepreneurs to come on and share their big secrets behind hitting that 6-figure milestone and sharing with you exactly what you need to be focusing on so that you can do the same thing. We have people like Denise Duffield-Thomas, Ashley Amberjay, Neil Patel, Joanna Penn, Suzanne Dibble, John Lee Dumas, and more. So make sure that you pop that in your diary. Monday, the 5th of November is when we will be kicking off the 6 Figures and Beyond real sales strategies behind the success series. I'm so blooming excited about it. I honestly cannot wait. Recording the episodes has been phenomenal. And we just have some phenomenal entrepreneurs and business owners coming onto the podcast to share all of their juicy sales tips, techniques, and tricks with you guys. So let's talk a little bit about podcasting, because it was something that I started in my business in September last year, frankly, because I had got tired of having to put makeup on to record videos. Now, before I started a podcast, I actually thought I was going to start a vlog. And I did actually record a few episodes, which if you scroll back enough on my blog, you can actually see some of the episodes that I recorded. And having been somebody that had recorded over 400 hours worth of Facebook Live videos, I kind of felt like vlogging was going to be easy. And the reality was for me that it actually wasn't. The difference for me between vlogging and Facebook Live seemed really stark when I actually started it. And for me, the difference was huge in terms of the commitment that it took, not only to producing the videos and the content itself, but also to the way I looked. It made me feel like I had to spend 2 days or 3 days a month in recording mode with makeup on, hair done, wearing clothes other than my pajamas. You know, it was just one of those things that I found really frustrating. And it didn't matter how many times people told me, don't worry, Jess, you'll get used to it. I just couldn't get into it. And so I was like, right, okay, what can I do that's going to light me up? What is the content model that I actually enjoy? And I stumbled across podcasting as being a method that I could actually use. Because before this point, I'd been consuming podcasts. I'd always been a massive fan of like Ali Brown's podcast. I'd been a big fan of other things that were fiction-based and in different areas. Cough, Love Island podcast. But I had never actually thought about setting up a podcast of my own before that point. So for me, it was a massive new venture. And we launched on my birthday last year, which I would not recommend if anyone's thinking about launching. Don't do it on your birthday. It's actually pretty stressful. And I was spending the day at the zoo whilst trying to be like, oh my God, hopefully people are listening to the podcast and reviewing it. There isn't really that good a Wi-Fi signal at the zoo. So if you're going to do it, try not to launch on a major event for you personally. Try and do it some other random time. But anyway, we launched the podcast September 2017, and I had no real expectations of it. My first thought was that we would give it a go. We would try it for 3 to 6 months and see what happened. And at that point in time, the whole reason behind me starting the podcast and starting to decrease on the amount of Facebook Lives that I was doing was that suddenly everyone was doing Facebook Lives. And I'd started doing Facebook Lives when it was a brand new thing. I was on Facebook Live on the first day that it ever came out, and it was so exciting. And I'd got to the point where every single time that I scrolled my Facebook feed, everything was a video and nothing was captioned, and I just couldn't be bothered to watch. And so I realized that for me, this idea of being able to be in people's earbuds when it was convenient to them, when they were walking the dog, when they were driving, when they were doing these things, just like I do, was way more appealing. And so I set out on this podcasting journey, if you like, to see what would happen, what it would create, whether or not it would work, whether or not I was going to be somebody who could be consistent with automated content and things. And so I started out, like I say, with this 3 to 6 month trial. And it was really interesting. The first weekend that the podcast went live, we didn't actually aim to be new and noteworthy on iTunes, because if you read any reviews and if you've listened to the episode with Rob Walsh, you will know new and noteworthy is its own little weird and wonderful entity, and it's not actually worth trying to hit. But the other thing that we really wanted to do with the podcast was to help my audience have another way of connecting with me, to get the help and support that they needed without having to log on to social media and get distracted. So we weren't expecting masses of downloads. We were expecting high engagement and reviews. And over that first weekend, that's exactly what happened. And, you know, I'm forever grateful to all those people who took the time out on that particular Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to figure out the nightmare that is submitting a written review on iTunes, because that crap gets difficult. I remember recording videos about it and trying to troubleshoot it and thinking, oh my goodness, Apple, why are you making my life so hard? But eventually we got there, and we got the podcast to a point where it started to, instead of being downloaded, 10, 20 times an episode, which, if you are concerned by vanity metrics at all, can be lethal for your ego. So if you're thinking about setting up a podcast, drop the ego. Don't worry about anything else. Just worry about engagement and what the podcast is actually producing after the show. But we started getting these like 10 to 20 downloads, and it started creeping up pretty quickly. It started creeping up to, 50 listens an episode, and 100 and 150 and beyond. And that was when it started to get really exciting. And I became this podcast nerd who wanted to know all the metrics and wanted to know what was going on. And so at the 3-month mark, I'd been paying to have the podcast produced professionally. So having Scott and his team professionally edit and produce the podcast with the interview elements on the Friday episodes, with the solo episodes. And I figured that the podcast, I wanted to keep it up because it was interesting for me, and it was clearly something that was interesting and engaging to my audience. They were listening to it, they were having discussions around it, people were finding it useful. But I also recognized that, like everything else in my business, the podcast needed to have an ROI. It needed to bring a return on investment, because currently it was costing me money, but it wasn't necessarily bringing anything in. And so at that point, I started focusing on how we could best monetize the podcast. And that was where it started to get really interesting for me, because previously I'd obviously focused on social media, I'd focused on my email list, and those things can take a little while to kick into sales mode. And here I'd been breaking all of my own rules, giving away completely free value for 3 whole months, not selling at all, not asking my podcast audience to do anything. And then I was kicking it into sales mode and effectively seeing what it would do and thinking about what experiments I could conduct to see how efficient we could make it and how quickly. Now, if you listen to the episode a few weeks ago with Rob Walsh, you'll know that podcasting is actually statistically really, really great, because it's not saturated. I'm going to give this caveat of yet. It's not actually a saturated medium yet. And in fact, the ratios are pretty phenomenal. For every 4,000 female bloggers, there is just 1 female podcaster. Okay, so it is a hugely, hugely untapped market. And so when I started conducting these sales experiments and asking my audience, my poddies, to buy, I didn't quite realize just how quickly it was going to start generating leads, and generating clients. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today, because really today is about understanding A, whether or not a podcast is right for you, and B, if you are going to set one up, what are the things that you should really be focusing on? And given that it's a sales podcast, obviously money is going to come into it here, but it's not just about saying, oh, cool, what did Gary Vee say the next big thing is? Or, what are the stats out there? Great, they look pretty good. Law of averages says that, if there are 4,000 bloggers, I should probably not do that. It's about really deciding if you are the sort of person who wants to spend the time, energy, and money creating a podcast, leveraging it, and then monetizing it. And if you are, or if you're thinking about it, you're kind of on the fence, listen through to the tips and tricks that I've got, learn from my mistakes, and then obviously decide whether or not a podcast is right for you. Now, I will put a quick plug in here before I start sharing all of the tips and tricks that I can anyway, is that this week, Podcasting That Pays has officially launched. So if you are interested in launching your own podcast and you're interested in learning from me because you want to create a podcast that you can monetize, you're interested in setting up your own podcast, having a super successful podcasting launch and monetizing it, then you need to head over to podcastingthatpays.com and you can see that I am launching brand new podcasting course. I have my podcast producer, Scott Dissett, who's come in to do all of the techie stuff. He's going to show you and be the technical whiz kid and genius and show you how to actually technically set it up and edit it. And I'm going to teach you how to create a mean, lean podcasting lead generation and monetization machine. So if you are interested in that, make sure you head over to podcastingthatpays.com. You can go over there, you can grab your spot. It is the first round that we'll be doing, and you will be getting some extra special bonuses because it is the first round. So let's talk about it. Podcasting, should you do it? Should you not? When it comes to having a podcast, the thing that people have been asking me is, what is the difference between having a podcast and having a vlog? And for me, having a podcast, I knew was going to be a slower burn in terms of audience building potentially, because YouTube is one of the world's biggest search engines, and no matter how much I love Apple, iTunes is just not. For me, it was actually easier to envisage success with a podcast. I knew that from my own content creation habits and the way that I prefer to show up, podcasting was going to be the easy choice for me. I didn't want to show up and have to wear makeup every day. I didn't want to have to sit in my office and record for 3 days a month, just changing my t-shirt, putting a hat on, trying to make myself look different so that every single video would look like it was recorded last week. I wanted an automated and batched content generation system that would genuinely help my audience and be useful to them on the go. And for me, that was about audio. Video didn't come into it because, as far as I'm concerned, you can't drive and watch a video. You can't walk the dog and watch a video. Obviously, the caveat here is that you can't drive responsibly and watch a video. You can't walk your dog responsibly and watch a video. And so I was one of those people who decided that audio was my medium. I am happy to talk to myself. So that was a big tick. I am happy to create content and batch create it. So that was a tick. And there was this little voice inside my head that said, when you get asked to do interviews, you always ask, is it going to be video or audio? And it's not that I care what I look like particularly. But if I go to an interview and it's late at night my time, or it's early morning my time, or it's post-gym workout, I know that if it's a video interview, I'm going to try and reschedule it around my diary to make it easier so that I have the time to do my hair, do my makeup, and feel confident when I show up. Whereas if it was a podcast interview, it doesn't matter what I look like, because what comes out of my mouth is the bit that's most important. So there's this voice in my head that kept saying that to me and saying, well, you know what, Jess, if you want to make the most of the podcast, and if you want to have a steady stream of guests, the easiest thing for them to do is to show up on audio. And in fact, when we started pitching people for the series coming up, the 6-Figure Success series, a lot of people came back and said, oh, we're really glad that this is an audio series, because it's so much easier to fit into our diaries. It's so much easier. We don't have to prep for how we look, hair, makeup, any of that. We can just get on, we can record it, and away we go. So a year down the line, I'm incredibly grateful that I made that decision. And if you're thinking about podcasting as being a potential avenue for you, have a think about whether or not you are the kind of person who is a visual learner or an audio learner, and whether or not your audience are the same. Do your audience actively listen to podcasts? And if they don't, would they listen to yours? And if they do, what kind of podcasts do they like? What do they enjoy? What do they not enjoy? I did a lot of market research before I set up my podcast. And the thing that I heard most often, the piece of feedback that I kept getting when I was asking people about podcasts and what they listened to, was that they were all starting to get samey. Nobody was doing anything different. And so, when we launched with that specific purpose of Monday episodes will be clear value that are going to teach people who listen how to do something that is specifically related to generating revenue in their business. And then Friday episodes, when we started, were all about, let's bring somebody on who has a question and live coach them to get the answers that they need, so that other people can realize, A, I'm not the only one, woohoo, and B, get the actual answers and see coaching in action, which wasn't happening in the podcasting space in 2017. There were very, very few podcasts that were doing live coaching and recording them for podcast episodes. Now there are actually quite a few more, and that's really nice. It's really nice that other podcasts are bringing that in, because I do think it's a really important aspect to bring to the table. But it's really interesting. We came in, we were early adopters of that particular element. It was one of the first things I said to Scott on setting up the podcast. I really want to live coach on there. I think it's really important. Nobody else is doing it. Let's do that. And now, obviously, it almost feels like we've set a trend. So yay, Smart Leader Sell Poddies. We have set collectively a trend, because some of you have been on the podcast. Lots of you have listened to the episodes and taken action on it. So I feel like it's a collective woohoo. Now, the second thing around building a podcast is that it is a slower burn. Okay, so it is a slower burn in certain circumstances. Now, I already had a warm audience. So if you're somebody who is setting up a podcast and you are brand new to podcasting, yes, you still can have a super successful launch. Yes, you probably even could get into new and noteworthy if you really wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend it. And yes, you can absolutely monetize your podcast in a similar amount of time as somebody who already has a warm audience. And the reason for that is that podcasting is what I would call a nurture tool versus being a lead generation or sales tool. It's the tool that you are using in your business to actually give people value. And so, yes, it does convert, it does produce leads, it does monetize, but the majority of people who have podcasts out there take a long time to monetize their podcasts. And it's because usually they're not selling on their podcast. They're not actually completing any kind of sales tasks. They don't have a sales quota for it, and they're not using their podcast to get an ROI. But also because typically people think of podcasting, because it is traditionally a nurture tool, they don't think of the different ways that you can monetize your podcast. And actually what I've found is that podcasting listeners, whilst it will take you a while to grow an audience, so when I'm talking about growing an audience, I'm talking about growing an audience organically on iTunes or on any of the podcast players, whilst that will take you a while, actually poddies tend to be way more loyal than people that join your tribe from social media. So they will stick around longer, they will consume more of your content quicker, and they will action it generally. And actually they convert into buyers quicker. So when you do sell on a podcast, the conversion rate is much higher than when you are putting it out there onto social media. And for me, that was really interesting because obviously sales nerd. And so I was kind of obsessive about where we were monetizing the podcast and how that was happening. What I found was that the majority of podcast listeners not only were converting into buyers quicker, but were also more likely to become high ticket or premium customers. All right. What I mean by that is that they were more likely to buy high ticket or premium services with a lot less nurturing than perhaps people who had been in a Facebook group or on another social media platform for a longer amount of time. Okay, so super, super simple. Poddies were listening to information, but it was taking less information, less nurturing to convert them to higher ticket sales than it was to convert people from social media. Now, that's a complete flip around for me, because obviously over the last 4 years, one of the major streams of my revenue was coming from Facebook. It was coming from Facebook groups, and specifically my Facebook group, because as we all know, too lazy to hang out in everyone else's. But it was one of the major sources of my revenue. And interestingly, we just had the cash creation launch in July 2018. And the interesting trend was that actually the listeners who came from the podcast bought quicker, took action quicker, and actually there was a higher amount of people who bought through the podcast who had become a poddie and then jumped on the email list or the wait list and bought, versus the people who had been involved in the Facebook group for much, much longer. So actually for me, it threw up this really interesting ROI conundrum in a way, because what we're being taught online by so many of the gurus is get a Facebook group, post 3 to 5 times a day, have your own Facebook group, spend all of your time answering a bunch of questions in there, be completely reactive, hang out on social media all day long, build this huge personal brand and do all this stuff. And the reality was that actually the latest launch was, okay, I've recorded a bunch of content, I've done it in advance, I'm now off on holiday, the content is going into our podcast host, Libsyn, and I'm going to come back and people have been buying stuff. Woohoo! Like that for me was much, much easier and much, much more successful than thinking about some of the launches and some of the things I've had to do over the years to generate a similar amount of revenue. So have a little think about that. If you are somebody who at the moment is thinking, oh God, I'm really put off by the idea of a podcast or a vlog or automated content because I feel like my audience need me to be reactive. I'm spending all my time in Facebook groups, answering questions, trying to give value, showing up on social media, trying to build, my Twitter numbers, my Facebook group numbers, my business page followers, my this, my that, the other. Actually, you could just streamline that and you could create a singular entity, i.e. a podcast, that would produce your revenue. And actually your business would not take a hit. And it's really interesting for me because I've been talking to people about this, obviously, talking to people about creating this course and the benefits of podcasting. And people have said, yeah, but I don't really get it. Like, how do people make money off of podcasting? And are podcasters really that successful? Now, obviously, last year I was at Upreneur, whoop, whoop, and I got to see John Lee Dumas and Pat Flynn speak. And the majority of speakers last year, and actually the majority of speakers this year, if I'm honest, were all podcasters. Now, John Lee Dumas obviously recorded an episode every single day. And so Entrepreneur on Fire is one of the most successful podcasts on the planet for entrepreneurs. And it has in excess of 1 million downloads. It has produced over $12 million in revenue. And that was as of November last year. And he regularly produces income reports that are 6-figure and multi-6-figure months. And his system is all drawn through his podcast. Okay. Pat Flynn, again, has Ask Pat. He has Smart Passive Income. And his business, again, his business model really is heavily based on his podcast. So there are some super, super successful podcasts out there. Equally, there are super successful other things. Some people have really successful Facebook groups or vlogs or blogs or whatever. But actually, saturation point is hitting in these areas. So podcasting is still the untapped, unsaturated area of the market. And I think that's really, really important for anyone who is wanting to produce content differently, who's wanting a more proactive approach to content. Actually, podcasting is awesome because you can batch record because you can set it on rinse and repeat. And actually you can do some really cool experimentation with it as well. So this year we've experimented with lots of different types of content on the podcast. And we've experimented with things like the live coaching sessions, which again, because we were one of the first podcasts to do the live coaching sessions, we weren't really sure how it was going to go, having a guest on the podcast, running live coaching sessions, particularly challenging in some regards as well. And so that was really interesting. We also ran the first podcast challenge, yay, which if you guys remember the Sales in for Summer challenge, that was so much fun. And it was so good for the poddies and also for my Facebook group audience and my email list community to actually do something different, and get content in a different and easy way. And so that was really interesting. And then obviously we've got the opportunity to really increase the leverage and increase the visibility of the podcast with the new 6-figure success series in November as well. And obviously I will keep you guys updated because you are the poddies, like who else deserves to know about it? But overall, it has been a year of wins. And so if you are setting up a podcast, I would really, really encourage you to think about how quickly these kinds of things have happened. And bear in mind, a year ago, I was brand new to podcasting. Okay. Yes, I'd had Facebook groups. Yes, I had an email list, but I had never, ever, ever launched a podcast. I'd never recorded a podcast of my own. And I was still at that stage where I would be on other people's podcasts as a guest expert. I didn't really like hearing my voice back because I do sound a little like Minnie Mouse on crack. But within a year, we've produced over 100 episodes. The podcast has been featured in the top 100 in iTunes. We've got a huge amount of 5-star ratings, which thank you very much if you've contributed to that. It's really, really something that I'm hugely grateful for, and it means an awful lot when we know that we're producing good content. We've had multiple people who've bought products and services come directly from the podcast. We've had people who've bought products and services that we've affiliated for, hosting through Libsyn. Recently when we were given an awesome promo code. So if you are looking at hosting a podcast and setting one up and you want to host with Libsyn because they are awesome, then you can use the promo code SALES in the show notes and you can go and enter that over at Libsyn, get a free month of hosting, which is awesome. And other affiliate products and services, which has been phenomenal. The other things that the podcast has really brought to the table is a new audience of different people who are engaged and loyal. And I think that that's something that every business really can do with. If you're somebody who currently has really struggled to build an audience and you're thinking, well, I don't really want to go through this whole tumbleweed approach again. Actually, podcasting is a really, really good way to build your tribe. It's a great way to build a connected and engaged tribe of people who believe in what you do, who have an actual commitment to you and to really helping you make the best kind of content. We get loads of questions about the podcast. We have lots of emails from people who tell us what they liked, what they didn't like. We have lots of emails from people who want to be guests. And actually, it's great. It's it's the piece of content that I put out most that gives the most engagement back, without really having to do that much other than, sit in my PJs and record an episode every so often. So it's great. And then obviously, we need to think about how you can monetize. We've started talking here about ROI. So let's just delve into what is the ROI of a podcast and what are some of the different ways that you can actually make money from podcasting? You've got the usual. You can do it like me. You can sell your own products and services from your podcast, or you can convert your poddies into leads by encouraging people to sign up for your email list. You can also affiliate for other products and services like we mentioned earlier with regards to Libsyn. If you look at people like John Lee Dumas's business, if you look at people like Pat Flynn's business, they do an awful lot when it comes to affiliate marketing. You can also get sponsorships. Okay, you can have your show sponsored by like-minded companies. And in fact, recently we were offered our first ever paying guest. Somebody wanted to pay to come on the podcast. And I was like, actually, we don't make people do that. But thanks anyway for the offer of your money. That's not who we are. But you can actually get sponsored for your podcast by relevant companies You can offer out guest spots that are paid, and obviously you can host your show and monetize it through using something like Patreon and asking your own podcast listeners to pledge donations each month to keep your podcast going and absorb some of the costs that are involved with setting it up. So if you are considering podcasting and I haven't won you over yet, then maybe it isn't the platform for you. But if you are sat there and you're thinking, actually, I would like a more proactive way of generating content. I would like an easier way for my audience to be able to consume information and things that are actionable without having to watch videos. If you want a content creation method that doesn't require any effort other than your mouth working and, not having to wear makeup, do your hair, even wear clothes, although I would advise that. I've not actually tried the old naked podcasting and I probably won't if I'm honest, but PJs work pretty well. And obviously, if you do want a content creation method that you can monetize and that you can do quickly, the great thing about a podcast is that just like any channel, really, you can monetize it as quickly and as easily as you choose to. And that comes with having the right strategy for it. And it comes with doing things in the right way and launching the right way. So if you are interested in podcasting, I highly, highly recommend it. I do thoroughly recommend it as a content creation platform. It has been honestly the best decision that I made in my business in 2017. And we've only got more exciting things to come in 2019 and beyond, once we finish with this year, obviously. So if you are interested in setting up a podcast and you would like my eyes to help you monetize it and Scott's ears to help you produce and edit the best podcast going in your area of expertise, make sure you head over to podcastingthatpays.com and you can see the sales page and all the juicy stuff that we will be giving away to help you produce the best podcast that you possibly can and help you generate as many leads and as much money as possible in 2019 and beyond. I hope you are having an epic week. We are in the final countdown for Youpreneur. I'm very excited and I'm actually going to be doing a super special episode that I haven't told any of the Youpreneur speakers about yet. So keep your eyes peeled 2 weeks after Youpreneur because there will be a super, super special episode that is coming out to give you the inside scoop on what it's really like to attend Youpreneur, what it's like to be a speaker there, and all of the juicy gossip in between. Have an epic week. I will see you on Friday for another awesome live coaching session before we head into the 6-Figure Success series. Yay! Have a wicked week, guys.